The static hums before every broadcast. It's the sound of distance, of miles of silence stretching across a dead world. Some nights, I let the radio play nothing but that static, because it reminds me that there's still something out there. A signal, a whisper, a chance that someone's listening. The world outside my window, it isn't a world anymore. It's a fever dream caught between fire and ash. The sky has turned a permanent shade of rust, not quite red, not quite brown, just something ugly and tired. Once it used to change color with the day, shifting from gold to indigo, but now it's stuck, like the earth itself has stopped breathing. The clouds are gone, burned away by heat so relentless it's as if the sun has forgotten how to set. They said it would start with melting ice caps, with a few more storms, a few more fires. They said we'd adapt. We didn't. Now the ocean has swallowed the coasts whole. Cities like New York and Karachi, entire metropolises, are buried beneath salt and silt. The tallest skyscrapers pierce the surface like gravestones, barnacled and broken. Inland, the heat claimed what was left. The rivers dried up, the trees fell, and the soil turned to powder. You can walk for days and see nothing but skeletons of buildings and bones of forests, all brittle, all whispering of a time that won't return. The wind carries more than dust now. It carries voices, echoes of things long dead. Sometimes, when the storms rise from the west, I can almost hear them scream. The scientists used to call it vocal distortion, the sound of hot air tearing through metal and glass. I think it's the earth remembering us. What remains of civilization hides in pockets, half-buried shelters, scavenger camps, broken radio towers like mine. There's no government anymore, no law, just whispers of warlords and coalitions that rose and fell like the tides. They fought for what was left, water, fuel, medicine. Now most of them are gone too, eaten by the very chaos they tried to control. Every once in a while, you'll catch a signal out there, a desperate voice calling coordinates, a plea for trade or refuge. Sometimes it's a trap. Sometimes it's worse, a faction using radio to lure in the lost. I learned that the hard way. That's why I stay here speaking into the void, not to command, not to deceive, but to remember. The old cities are monuments to our arrogance. I passed through Denver once, what's left of it. The glass towers have melted into jagged teeth. The asphalt is split open like cracked skin, and the air tastes like iron. I saw a bus frozen mid-collapse, its passengers still strapped in, mummified by heat. A museum once stood nearby, filled with paintings, fossils, artifacts, proof that we'd survived before. It's gone now. Just charred walls and melted frames. Maybe that's fitting. We built our shrines to memory and then we burned them. In the South, they say wildfires never stop. They crawl across the land like living things, devouring what little green remains. Smoke chokes the horizon, a gray shroud that never lifts. In the North, it's the cold that kills, sudden freezes that crack the earth and shatter bones. There's no balance left, no rhythm, just chaos. And then there's the prisons. When the power grids failed, the locks failed too. One by one, every gate opened. Steel doors clanged wide, and from them poured not just criminals, but survivors, men and women who'd been buried alive, forgotten by a collapsing world. Some tried to rebuild. Most didn't. The ones that did, they made their own kind of justice. In the cities, they rule the ruins like kings. In the wastelands, they roam like wolves. They're not the only monsters out here, but they're the ones who remember the taste of cages. Now the nights are the hardest. There's no moon anymore, just a faint, dull glow that bleeds through the smoke. It casts long shadows that move when you're not watching. I've learned to sleep in short bursts, always with one hand on the switch, one eye on the door. But every morning I climb the rusted stairs, I turn the crank, I start the generator. And I speak, because maybe someone's listening. Maybe somewhere in the ruins of another city, another survivor is tuning in. Maybe they're staring out at their own wasteland, wondering if anyone remembers how it used to be. This is what's left of Earth, a planet gasping through its final breaths, a people scattered, broken, but not gone. and me a voice in the static, holding onto a memory, a signal, a story. You are listening to the radio, and I am still here. I keep my hands busy so my mind doesn't wander to the things that hurt the most. There's always something to do. A loose wire to solder, a cracked valve to patch, an old battery to be coaxed back into life. The radio never looks like a relic to me, it's a temple. A bad tube or a frayed coax can mean silence, and silence in a broken world is worse than hunger. So I work on small, precise things and I speak into the microphone. The speech is both ritual and duty. It is how I survive. My name is irrelevant out here. On air, I use the call sign I found carved into the desk of the old radio station. K7MA, it's easier to be a set of letters than to be the man who lost a wife to fever and a son to a raid. Easier to be a voice than to show the scar that runs from my jaw down to my collarbone. Names stick. Call signs float. Before the sky turned rust, I was an electrical tech. I fixed power in hospitals, rewired schools, patched transmission lines that hummed with other people's lives. The work kept me busy, and I liked that the hum of machines, the certainty that a socket would light up a room. When the heat started, the same hands that rewired streetlights learned to jury-rig a condensation trap and a solar still. When the roads melted and the supply chain stopped, those hands learned to scavenge patience, too. Everything I do now is a version of repair, of radios, of relationships, of a voice trying to stitch a map of what was left. Survival is methodical, as mundane as it is desperate. Water is the first lesson. I don't hunt for springs or dream of mountain reservoirs. I build what I can. A rooftop rain catcher fed through corrugated pipe into a buried barrel. A shallow solar still tucked beneath glass to pull moisture from the air. A Wiccan charcoal filter for last resort cleaning. I've carried books, old engineering manuals, and a kid's science guide in my pack all at once. The science guide has worked as well as any professor when it came down to boiling and distillation. Food is foraged, bartered, or grown in small, stubborn beds of herbs and root vegetables behind reinforced corrugated walls. It isn't much, but it's mine, and that matters. Shelter is another exercise in humility. I live in a half-collapsed post office that still remembers stamps and long-ago mail routes. I reinforce the roof with corrugated metal scavenged from a collapsed gymnasium. The windows are boarded, and the entrance is a maze of crates and rusted filing cabinets that confuse the wind and slow the curious. I sleep on a cot, with a wool blanket that used to be someone's wedding present. At night, I keep the generator in the next room and listen to it sputter like a living thing. It eats oil and patience. It runs the transmitter and the small heater we turn on for the worst nights. Energy is currency now. I have a modest solar array, 3 panels rigged to an old car battery bank and a converted inverter. On clear days, it charges the batteries enough to run the transmitter for hours. On cloudy, smoky days, I pedal. I keep a bicycle-driven dynamo in the corner. Pedaling while reading letters to the air is good for the legs and the conscience. Fuel is a secret you don't tell often. I trade medicine and spare parts for a few liters of diesel when I need to run the generator. I learned early how to siphon, refine, and ration. Everyone who lasts learns to make fewer demands on the world. The radio itself is part museum, part machine shop. It's a hybrid of vacuum tubes and scavenged solid-state parts, a Frankenstein transmitter that throws warmth into the air in the voice of someone still trying to remember how to hope. I keep a ledger of frequencies and times, old ham bands, emergency channels, a few shortwave ranges I've learned to favor in the quiet hours. I tape names on the desk. Aisha 32524, reply to 14.2 KHZ, and Dr. Ken, Med Supply. Little reminders that people were once inside the grid, reaching out across a civilized map we no longer own. What drives me isn't some grand notion of saving the world. It's smaller, meaner, and truer. Responsibility. There were a dozen times after the first summer when I could have fled, when my repairs couldn't keep up and the howling outside promised easier pickings for roaming gangs. I thought of leaving, one foot on the ruined porch, a pack slung across my back. Each time I turned back to the transmitter. Someone had written me once, a short hand-scribbled message nailed to a tree near a crossroads. "We hear you. Don't go dark." That was enough. People listen. They need to know someone else still remembers them. Connection is also an engine. I speak into the static and remember a laugh, a name, a smell. It's dangerous to hold memory like a talisman because memory demands more of you, but it keeps me human. I read names on air and sometimes a voice answers. "Here," they say, rough with smoke and time. "Here we hear." For a splinter of a moment the world reframes. I am not the last man. I am transmitter and listener both. Those small acknowledgments, a child's cough in the background, a barter offer in broken radio phrases, they are oxygen. Loss is the other constant. I carry it like lead in my chest. My wife, Samira, died 3 winters ago after the water cartel attacked a convoy carrying vaccines. She bandaged a stranger and bled out on my lap while the convoy's tires spun in the mud. I still reach in the dark some nights and feel the shape of her face as if she might be there. My son, Tariq, left when he was 17 to join a coalition of scavengers hunting for mechanized parts. He wanted purpose. I wanted safety for him and couldn't give both. Months later, a witness said they saw a group pull back from a ruined factory, bodies thrown into a pit. The voice I heard over the wind said, "They were not buried with prayer." I do not know if that was Tariq. I do not know what to do with not knowing. There's a hollow the size of a human where certainty used to be. Guilt is a daily ration. There are times I try to make it useful. I fix radios in exchange for bread. I teach someone how to mend a water pump. But guilt is hollow if not shaped into action. So I act. I trade parts for stories. I relay coordinates when survivors ask. I play a tape of a lullaby Samira used to sing when a child requests it. Music is a currency that buys quiet for a night, and I have learned to spend it. Trust is the hardest thing. I have let people in before. Once I sheltered a small family for 3 months, feeding them and teaching the mother how to maintain a crude battery bank. In the end, they left with my last can of diesel and my best solar diode. I learned to keep my doors wired with a bell and a trip line. I learned to listen to the skin of people, not just their words. You can hear fear. You can hear calculation. You can hear when someone is honest about their hunger. Sometimes my honesty feels like a liability. I broadcast warnings when a gang moves through a valley. I read coordinates when I hear of a new water source. I admit when I am scared. Admitting fear is a risk, but so is silence. The truth has kept a few from walking into traps. If someone steals a battery and dies in the cold because they couldn't make a still, I cannot fix that. I can only keep talking. There are small rituals that keep me steady. Every night before I go on air, I run a hand over a rag-worn photograph. Samira smiling with a child's hand in hers. I light a candle at dusk on the counter, and the flame is tiny but steady, a deliberate, stubborn defiance against the dark. I log every broadcast in the ledger, the same way a ship keeps a log at sea. I speak the date out loud, even when the calendar pages are gone. September 30, 2029, I'll say into the microphone, and the sound of my own voice anchors me to the moment. Hope is not a banner I carry openly. It is a thread woven through the tasks of survival. To mend a pump, to teach a child to boil water properly, to pass on the knowledge that a solar still needs sealing tape to function. Hope is small and practical here, a list of things to be done before the next windstorm. It's tasting a sprout in the morning and knowing there will be another. It's the sound of a voice on the line answering back. So I keep the transmitter alive. I keep the ledger updated. I pedal the dynamo when the batteries sag. I tell stories on the air, small, true things, because stories are proof we were not always hungry and afraid. If someone out there remembers how to build a windmill, I want them to know I'll show them where the metal is. If someone remembers how to solder a diode, I'll swap them wheat. That's how we pass on the light. I am not a hero. I am a maintenance man for memory. I keep the radio warm and I keep my hands busy. I pull the plug on despair and let the signal breathe. If that makes me a guard of some small, fragile hope, I will accept the title. I will accept the responsibility. They called it the summer that wouldn't end at first, a headline that fit into a world that still believed in headlines. By the time the prisons opened, it was just another line in a ledger, another collapse recorded between the dates of nothing and less. The primary crisis that chews at the edges of everything now is simple and terrible. The climate that used to cradle us shifted into a new, violent mode and never shifted back. It started with heat and ended in a collapse of systems, hydrology, agriculture, transportation. Everything that once let 50 people in a city pretend they could live off the labor of 1,000. Listen, heat isn't polite. It rewrites rules. It changes where rain falls and where rivers run. For years the pattern was subtle, winters shorter, storms stranger, but then the storms stopped being predictable. The jet stream buckled like a snapped wire, and entire weather systems parked over regions for months. Some places had furious, endless rains that carved valleys where roads used to be. Other places baked under a sky that felt like an oven door left ajar forever. Where I live, the rain simply stopped. The springs died. The reservoirs shrank until they were nothing but greenish mud puddles that smelled of rot. The rivers, the arteries of human settlement, ran thin, then cracked. Plants withered in their roots. The ground split like old paint. But climate didn't do this alone. It set off a chain reaction. Permafrost thaw released gases. Wetlands dried and turned into tinder. Ocean currents shifted and brought storms to shores that never expected them. The seas rose in places and receded in others, leaving salt in the soil where wheat once grew. Food failed. Where crops failed, hunger followed. Where hunger follows, law fades. Then came the power outages. Grids overloaded, coal plants failed. Nuclear stations were stabilized by crews that would never come back to finish the job. When the lights went, locks stayed open, and that's how the prisons unlocked. Not by mercy, but by entropy. Generators sputtered, gates lost their electric teeth, and human beings, for all our neat classifications, criminal, civilian, patient, poured out into a world with no infrastructure and no promise. They weren't the only ones to emerge, but they were organized in ways the starving and the scared were not. Where a starving mother scavenged, a former inmate with a plan could take, net, and organize. Some of them tried to rebuild. Many did not. And that made the world more dangerous than the climate alone. Survival is harder every day because the baseline resources are thinning, and the systems that distributed them are gone. Water is my first, constant worry. Where I used to measure worry in hours, now it's measured in sips. My still's a rooftop catcher, a solar still, a rope and condensate rig I made from plastic sheeting get me through, but they are fragile. The condensation in a still will drop from a few liters a day to nothing if particulate pollution blocks the glass, or if the nights are too warm for effective condensation. Wells go dry. Shallow aquifers are contaminated with salt and runoff. The simplest science is a cruel joke here. Evaporation increases with heat, which means the same water that would have nourished crops is lost to the air. When the soil holds more salt than root can bear, plants die. We lose not only food, but the very microbes that make soil fertile. Food is the next knife edge. The loss of consistent rainfall destroyed seasonal planting windows. The supply chains that once ferried grain to cities collapsed after the first bad summer, and then the second. Seeds rot in warehouses or are burned for fuel. What food is available is priced in bullets, not coin. I keep a small garden, 3 raised beds behind the post office, fed with compost and gray water, but it feeds pride more than it feeds anyone else. Root vegetables, hardy greens, beans saved through the winter. These are my small victories. If a winter is too cold, they die. If a hot wave strikes, they scorch. We barter food for parts, for medicine, for fuel. But each trade is a thinning of stores and a widening of mouths to feed. Fuel is a currency that vanishes. Diesel keeps the generator alive and keeps the heater sputtering on the worst nights. I trade medicine, charge the battery bank for a convoy, and hope the wheels keep turning. Without fuel, you cannot pump water, move goods, or run heavy equipment to dig wells or move stone. Solar panels help, but they are treasures with limits. Brittle frames, cracked glass, government-grade inverters that need specific diodes no one manufactures anymore. Batteries degrade. Lead-acid banks suffer when left discharged. Inverters overheat in the smoke. The knowledge that once kept a power plant humming is dispersed now, like pollen on a wind that no longer cares where it falls. People are another resource, sometimes the most dangerous one. Encounters with others have become lessons in calibration. There are alliances, scavenger crews who trade work for protection, medical enclaves holed up in old clinics where someone, once a doctor, now a preacher of antiseptic routines, still knows how to stitch or set a bone. I've worked with Dr. Ken over the airwaves. Sometimes he relays a note about antibiotics or a field sterilization trick. Aisha, I've heard her voice twice, a woman who runs a small water-finding crew. She's traded coordinates and a recipe for a biochar filter once. These people are lifelines. Trust them and they keep you alive. Trust them and sometimes they take what you cannot spare. You learn to ask questions and read the silence between answers. Then there are the hunters groups that were once prisoners, militia, or corporate security teams who rebranded as collectives. They map the mapless, move with a feral precision, and take the things that will make their lives sustainable. Engines, fuel, medicine. They're not always evil. Often they're desperate people with an organized capacity for violence. A caravan of them passed near my old route once, sunscreen on their lips and old uniforms patched into a uniform of rust. They marked a path by burning everything that could give shade or shelter to anyone who followed. After they left, we found a field of dead shrubs and a note nailed to a telephone pole. No disclaimers. Territory claimed. Most people move away. Some move in. The ones who move in are the ones you stay awake worrying about. Severe weather hits like a second enemy. The storms are different now, not the short, stinging kind, but walls of wet and wind that devour anything not bolted down. I've seen a microburst that blew corrugated metal like paper and flattened a line of abandoned cars into a single, melted heap. The dust storms are worse. They carry fine particulate that clogs filters, abrades lungs, and brings toxic residues from chemical plants that once sat by the river. The worst nights are the toxic rains, when the sky opens and pours water that carries acid and metal salts that poison the soil and the children's teeth. We learn to read the sky again by smell, and by the way the wind moves the blackened grass. We chain our supplies when the forecasts go bad. Why does this keep getting harder? Because everything we depended on was optimized for a different climate and a different population density. Food production required predictable seasons. Cities required cheap energy and long-distance logistics. When those assumptions fail, the entire design of civilization becomes brittle. Things that once were redundancies vanish. The bureaucracy that allocated water evaporates with the cities. The legal structures that could have mediated conflicts are gone. In their place sprouted local rule, often violent and always opportunistic. I'm a technician, not a politician, so I talk about limits in terms of parts and matter. The physical limitations are straightforward. Finite aquifers, degraded arable land, limited days of stored seed that actually germinate, fuel in barrels that goes rancid. On a human scale, exhaustion, trauma, and the attrition of knowledge. The last factor, knowledge loss, is the quiet, grinding throttle on our life expectancy. My little ledger is an attempt to arrest that. How to make a still, how to splice a damaged diode, how to culture yeast from scraps. If someone forgets the science of fermentation, they lose one of the ways to preserve calories. If a generation grows up without knowing how to mend a pipe, they die in storms that would have been survivable. That's why I read out instructions sometimes. Not just coordinates or names, but small, usable recipes for survival. Here are some of the practical things I say on the air when a voice asks how to live. Collect water by surface tension and condensation when rain is absent. A solar still made from a shallow pit, a cup in the center, and plastic sheeting sloped into the sun will condense water over a day if the ground is damp. If you have a corrugated roof, rig gutters and feed them into a covered barrel. Keep the barrel shaded and covered to prevent evaporation and contamination. Boil water when you can. If you cannot boil, at least filter through cloth and charcoal. Charcoal filters, a layer of gravel, sand, finely powdered charcoal, and cloth, remove particulates and some toxins. They're not perfect for industrial contamination, but they work better than nothing. I say these things over and over until my throat raws from the repetition. Save seeds the way you save a last photo. Label them with dates, store them dry in glass jars with silica if possible, and rotate them annually. Focus on hardy, open-pollinated varieties that breed true. Not everyone has the luxury for heirlooms, but beans and millets survive where wheat will not. Conserve power by running only essential loads. Charge batteries only during peak sun, and avoid deep discharges on lead-acid banks when you can. Use small DC appliances directly where possible to avoid inverter losses. If you have to run a generator, cluster tasks, pump water, then run the compressor, then charge the batteries, so you make the most of each fuel burn. Preserve food by drying and smoking when refrigeration is not an option. Salt, sugar, and sun will keep meat and fruit longer than you expect. If you have a fermentation culture, learn to lactoferment. It preserves and adds calories. Barter knowledge. Teach someone how to mend a pump in exchange for medicine. Trade skills in public places or over scheduled broadcasts. It's how communities stitch themselves back together. Sometimes these instructions make a difference. Sometimes they lead people into traps. A naive broadcast on where to find metal once brought a crew that stripped the bones of a water pump and took the spare parts, leaving the owner with a dry well and a rifle in their face. That lesson made me stop saying precise coordinates on the air unless I could vouch for the recipients. Trust is a ration too. I conserve it. We face limits in the social fabric as well. The trauma is cumulative. People who have seen their children die, who have starved, who have watched their lovers' names fade from the ledger, they change. They build walls around themselves and then fortify those walls with cruelty. That's the darker feedback loop. As scarcity increases, empathy decreases. We become less capable of cooperative behavior at the very moment cooperation is most vital. There are flickers of coordinated response. Small networks, old NGOs turned local, a cooperative of farmers who water test and share data over a shortwave link. They are fragile, their protocols hand-stitched from older manuals and newer ingenuity. But they are proof that organization is possible in the gaps. I keep a schedule for their messages. I broadcast their needs. I try to patent my voice against the cacophony of despair. The crisis is not a single hammer blow. It's 1,000 small, grinding failures. A radiator that fails in a clinic. A seed that doesn't germinate. A truck that refuses to start. When these add up, they become catastrophic. The prison's opening was a punctuation mark in a paragraph already full of commas. It rearranged the social order and added predation to the list of dangers. Every time I sign on, I feel the weight of that. I read the dates aloud. Announce a small how-to for someone trying to save a child with a temperature spike. Warn a farming collective of a wind shear 2 days out, and I listen. Because what survivaliveness we have left isn't a matter of hoarding. It's a function of shared knowledge and small acts of mutual aid. The day I refuse to teach a man to fix a water pump because I'm afraid he will take my diesel is the day I become a calculator of losses instead of a connector. I refuse that. Still, the crisis tightens. The next season promises less water and more fires. The convoys move less often. The gangs consolidate. The storms change bearers and arrive earlier. That is why I keep speaking, because even as the mechanics of the disaster complicate and compound, the one thing I can do is pass along what I know. And maybe, just maybe, someone out there with better hands and a steadier spine will hear it, take what I give, and do more than survive. They will build. That's the math I prefer to believe in, not statistics or models I can't verify, but human action multiplied. One wheelbarrow of seed becomes a row. One well dug properly spreads water to 3 homes. One person taught how to patch an alternator keeps a light on for a night and a life from being lost. The crisis is huge. Our choices are small. The distance between them is where we live. They came on a Thursday, which used to be the market day in the town that used to sit 2 valleys over. On Thursdays, people traded bread and gossip and small kindnesses. On this Thursday, the sky was a low bruise and the wind tasted like metal, and by noon a thin column of smoke marked where a convoy had burned out on the pass. My receiver picked up the sound, a frantic, half-formed voice repeating a handful of coordinates, then cutting to static. I keyed the microphone and sent out the only thing I had that might matter, warning. I gave them a route, a place to hide, and the name of a creek that still ran through an old culvert. It was a small thing. It might have been the difference between life and not. That's the shape of things now. Small acts under a sky that keeps getting meaner. Resources that used to seem like abstractions, rations, reserves, stockpiles, are now numbers you can count by heart. I know how many liters of water are in the barrel behind the post office. I know how many days the garden will keep if I don't share a single sprig. I can tell you how many hours of generator time remain if the grade of fuel holds. The ledger on my desk is a map of scarcity, dates and amounts who traded what for what, and sometimes the blunt arithmetic of need. When entries start with stolen or taken or consumed, the hand that writes the numbers tightens. That week, the convoy's distress call came from a route I'd walked years ago. I sent them into the culvert hiding place, told them to wait for 4 hours, and then cut my own broadcast short. I pedaled the dynamo and silenced the transmitter so that only my breathing filled the room. Hour by hour, the noises outside folded into a single sound, the approach of people with a plan. Raiders. They have a cadence all their own, boots with iron plates that clank, the rattle of scavenged firearms, and that low, practiced laugh that comes from power. I could hear them before I could see them on the ridge. They found the convoy anyway. My warning slowed the predators down, but it did not stop them. Men with belts of shells stood in the cracked sun and took what they wanted. Engines, water, a pair of radios that had been the lifeblood of a small village. I watched them from the window as if the glass itself could hold back what they were doing. In the aftermath, the convoy scattered. A child wailed somewhere in the dust. A woman wrapped her head with a torn shirt and moved like a shadow. 3 bodies were left on the road. I know the face of one well enough to name it in my head. I have to because names anchor me. They named themselves too Blake's Boys, the Red Teeth. The free hands and names became flags that others waved. Attacks are surgical now. Raiders strike the weak first and then lay claim to anything that remains useful. They hunt on intelligence and rumors. If someone on the air speaks publicly about a water collection, they'll come. If a farmer posts a sign offering help in exchange for repair parts, that sign will attract more than grateful neighbors. People learn to speak in cryptic codes and timed broadcasts, but even codes can be brute-forced by hunger. The garden behind the post office frayed under the heat that summer. Leaves curled into themselves and the beans refused to climb. I rationed water down to trickles and fed the seedlings compost tea and whispered half apologies as I watered them. The tomatoes I'd coaxed into life split overnight when the wind carried salt from the far river. I lost 2 rows in one cruel morning and watched the plants die like anyone watching a small mercy suffocate. Food is not merely calories now. It is story, identity, and inheritance. When you lose a crop, you lose a conversation piece around which people would once gather. You lose a reason to sing. Then came the rumor. It began as a voice on a distant frequency, a woman's voice, soft and sharp as glass, who called herself Mara. She spoke in fragments at first. Hollow spring metalworks, turbines not all gone. I replayed the recording 3 times before I believed anything. People make myths out of scarcity. We invent green places where rain still falls, communities that found a way to desalinate seawater with old refrigerators, legends of vaults stocked with canned peaches. My ledger is full of such stories, many crossed out in ink. But Mara's voice had details. She spoke of a place called the Hollow, a ruination near a collapsed dam where a group of former prisoners and a few old municipal engineers had managed to cobble together a working wind-driven desal unit. She described panels of corrugated iron bent into concentric troughs that fed a makeshift intake, turbines built from wheel rims and bicycle cranks, and a clever bit of piping that pushed brackish water through charcoal and sand filters warmed by the sun. In short, a machine that turned salt into drinkable water, and someone who knew the code to keep it running. If true, it would change everything for the region. Not everyone believed it. Some called it a trap. Others said it was an old dream of engineers amplified into a promise by people who needed hope. Still, the calls started to come. You heard of Hollow. Is Mara real? Anyone know the coordinates? My inbox of scratched out letters and dropped messages swelled with questions. People wanted to travel. People wanted to trade for access. People wanted to die on the line to get a single glass. The more plausible the rumor sounded, the more dangerous it became. Knowledge is a vector for violence. If the Hollow existed, it would draw caravans, armies, and every organized crew with a short rhyme for justice. If it did not, its rumor would still peel people away from safe routes into fire. I listened to the debates on the air and felt the same thing I feel when I lift a burned piece of wiring, an electric shock of responsibility. Do I speak? If I broadcast the coordinates and someone dies, I have blood on my hands. If I stay silent and a new community perishes for lack of water, I have blood on my hands. Myriad small crises were piling on top of each other. The battery bank lost a cell. Corrosion had eaten through a connection. I had enough parts to try a repair, but not enough to guarantee success. The diesel stash dwindled down to a single jerry can, and I rationed its use to nights of high wind when the transmitter needed a boost. The post office's foundation had shifted in the last quaking. The roof bone, the entire truss, creaked when the wind reached certain speeds. I spent hours under the rafters like a priest murmuring to the god of carpentry, hammering nails, binding joints with cable and prayer. Sleep returned in 4-minute increments. The human cost of this escalation left marks deeper than any scar. I had a visitor, a man who called himself Hattie, who claimed to be from a collective a day's walk north. He carried a child on his shoulders and a story wrapped in hope. We heard the Hollow might have power, he said, and the child coughed in the wind. Hattie wanted to barter for a schematic, any drawing that would help their group build a filter. He offered canned milk and a dozen matches. I weighed his need against my own. I thought of the day when I gave away a radio to a family in exchange for a jar of honey and came home to find my inverter stripped clean. I thought of how easy it was to be betrayed when your hands shook from hunger. Compassion is a dangerous luxury in this season, but so is cowardice. I showed Hattie a sketch, a rough diagram of a solar still and a charcoal filter, enough to get them started but not enough to hand over a blueprint for desalination. He left with rice and sugar and a promise to return with a patch of copper wire. The child coughed less the next day. That small mercy cemented in me the idea that the right thing and the safe thing are not always the same. The raiders escalated too. With the rumor of the Hollow spreading, they became bolder. They posted lookouts on ridgelines and used signal mirrors to scan valleys for telltale green, gardens, oases, the glint of metal indicating panels. Once they find a place, they mark it with a crude flag, a tattered cloth on a sapling, and return later with drums and a list of demands. I saw them approach a nearby hamlet, and by the time the smoke drifted through my window, the people of that hamlet had been dispersed and their solar panels stolen. Children were often the first to be taken as bargaining chips. A grim exchange economy took root where human life could be weighed against a battery. That's the moral equation of this time. Human life divided by utility. It's ugly and it's efficient. It makes monsters of people who have only ever known scarcity. It makes saints of those who refuse to profit from pain. Internally, I wore thin. I am a man who believes in hands-on work. Soldering, sealing, building. But the erosion came on my heart in softer ways. Nights were hardest when memory arrived without warning. The names of the people I had loved would come like leaks through a roof. Tariq, Samira, the neighbor Jonas who once taught me how to splice a bicycle chain. I became adept at compartmentalizing. I inscribed obligations in the ledger and transferred grief into instruction. When I taught someone how to make a wick filter, I gave them a task and a story, and it eased the ache for a moment. But you cannot train a wound to heal by habit alone. The mystery of the hollow tugged at me because it offered a direction. Hope with a map matters more than hope without one. I started to build a plan, not to lead a caravan or to found a commune, but to function as a node. If the hollow was real, I could be a waypoint. I could warn convoys, relay needs, barter for parts, and perhaps, if fate allowed, trade for access. That plan required fuel and allies and, most crucially, information. Information now was your most perishable resource. It decayed in hours when raiders read it. So I began to tighten the network I had. A handful of trusted voices I'd met in the past year. A doctor who answered once a week with a strict call sign. A woman in the East who traded animal emulsion for batteries. A small collective of farmers who promised to spare seeds if I would teach a neighbor how to repair a pump. I set times for coded broadcasts. 3 pips and a line for calls about water, 2 pips and a whistle for travel warnings. We adopted an economy of words. The fewer you used, the less you exposed yourself. This tightening was not merely for efficiency, it was for survival. The world was not only running out of water and fuel, it was also running out of trust. To survive the next season, we would have to rebuild that trust, but differently. We would have to make it transactional and then generous, a strange marriage of barter and compassion. The hollow rumor forced us to reckon with that. If someone built a desalination machine and guarded it with guns, it would be a fortress. If someone shared it, then maybe the future had a chance. And so the tension builds not in a single stampede, but in 100 small decisions. Do I broadcast a coordinate? Do I share a diagram? Do I open the gate to a stranger? Each decision has consequences that echo outward, like ripples on a black pond. The stakes are not only life and death, but the shape of the society we will leave to the next generation. Will it be one of closed gates and guarded cisterns? Or will it be a loosely stitched patchwork of people who learn to trade knowledge before bullets? I do not have answers, only a ledger and a microphone and the habit of telling the truth as I see it. The rising action of our world is less a single event than a multiplying of pressures. The hollow could be salvation or bait. The raiders could consolidate into a local regime or be stripped by their own greed. The storms could shift and kill entire harvests. Or a wet front could restore a river for a season and give us a breathing space. None of this is promised. All of it is possible. So I keep speaking. I warn convoys. I teach how to build a still and how to read the wind. I listen to Mara's fragmented broadcasts and catalog each syllable. I ration my diesel, repair a battery, and feed the seedlings with the one last cup of compost. I make plans that are humble enough to be carried in a knapsack and sturdy enough to survive a theft. I sharpen my distrust into a tool, but try not to let it cut me off from the small kindnesses that keep people alive. The world outside tightens like a fist. Inside, I keep the radio warm and a seed in a jar labeled by date. Between those two actions, broadcasting and preserving, I am trying to hold open the narrow crack through which a future might crawl. The rising tension is not only around us, it's inside the work I do, inside the ledger, inside the small mathematics of hope. They told me the hollow was a myth until the night the sky split open. Mara's voice came through on a ragged frequency at dusk, barely a thread of sound wrapped in static, and when she spoke the word pump, my hands went cold. It was the kind of word that makes mechanics sit up in the dark. Pump. Not temple, not miracle, not haven. Just pump. A machine that moves water is a small god in a world where rivers have forgotten how to be rivers. Hattie came back with the child, this time bleeding from a scratch on his temple and smelling like smoke. He'd courted the wind and the road for 3 days, followed hints and scraps of radio chatter, and he had a face like a man who had been given a choice he didn't want. They took the East Road, he said without preamble. Blake's boys, we dodge, but they're smart. They know the radio patterns. 2 days out, they said. The hollow, it's real. K7MA, we saw low turbines and a run of sun panels half buried. Mara, she said they'll trade water for parts. They said they'll let a few in if you have something to show. I measured my options the way I always do. In parts, in liters, in the small arithmetic of what I could lose and what I could gain. The transmitter sat between me and the world like an apology and a promise. It had kept voices alive, stitched people to places, sewn maps that mattered. The transmitter was my temple. It was also a machine that could become other things if taken apart. There was another clock running under everything, the weather. The foreboding smell was there before the first curl of wind. A sharp, metallic tang that told me the atmosphere had packed up something it shouldn't be carrying. Mara's last fragment before she faded to static was a warning. Toxic front. 2 nights. If the sky turns green, do not, and then nothing. We had 2 nights at best. Radars and weather do not coordinate by design, they coordinate by opportunity. Blake's boys were opportunists with a plan. If the hollow produced water and someone else produced a path to it, then the hollow would be a prize. If the hollow was generous, it would be a target. My ledger filled with the faces of those who could be lost if I made the wrong call. I spent the first night methodically the way a surgeon spends the last minutes before an operation. I took stock. 1 jerrycan of diesel, 3 panels of solar with cracked mounts, a worn inverter that coughed under load, and the transmitter, a tangle of tubes, reel-to-reel spool, a handful of vacuum valves that in other hands might have been worthless curios. I had the bike dynamo that could give me an hour of charge for every 10 minutes of pedaling. I had my hands. Hattie wanted me to come north with them, to the hollow. He wanted me to fix whatever part Mara claimed was broken. We can carry the parts, he said, his voice small against the creeping wind. We'll trade labor for water. We'll bring guards. The truth, I was useless on the road. The post office had bones I knew. My transmitter breathed in my chest, and the city between me and the hollow had mouths that needed feeding with the simplest things. Instructions, warnings, the human consolation of someone saying here, on the other end of the band. If I left, the radio might go quiet for good. If I stayed, the hollow might be plundered and its work undone. There was an uglier calculus too. The transmitter's guts could be a pump, copper wire relays, a coil, a motor repurposed, enough ingenuity and patience to splice and rebuild a heart for the hollow's throat. I could give them water for a season, and in doing so, give my voice away. The paradox pressed on me like a hand on the mouth. Keep the voice and people suffer. Break the voice and maybe many live. That night I remembered Samira in a small, painful detail. How she once asked me, in the night between tasks, whether the things I fixed were for her or for the rest of the world. I'd said then that I did it because things should work. She'd laughed and said that people mattered more than sockets. I'd argued then about utility. Now the memory felt like a ledger with a single line, choices measured by who survives. My decision was not made in a single blaze of heroism. It came in 100 quiet compromises. The way I checked each screw twice. The way I taped the last instruction to the board so some poor hand would find it when they needed it. By dawn I had made the choice. I would go to the hollow, but not as a passenger. I would disassemble the transmitter into parts that could be repurposed, and I would ride with Hattie and his small band. The radio would go silent. In its silence, water might sing. We left at dawn with 3 others. Hattie, a woman named Layla who could mend a bearing with a spoon and a prayer, and Jonas's son, a boy with Jonas's steady hands and his father's stubborn jaw. We carried the transmitter's heaviest pieces wrapped in oilcloth, like relics bound for another altar. The journey north was a map of the dying, a school playground where the swings hung like broken ribs, a gas station whose pumps had rusted into offering only ghosts, a bridge down to the bedrock where water had once rushed, and now a few birds picked at the bones of the asphalt. The wind drove salt across the plain, and at times the air tasted like metal. We reached the hollow by following a line of bent reeds and a thin chatter of birds that still nested in the ruins. From a distance it looked like any other ruin, corrugated skins and concrete skeletons. Up close, it was absurdly hopeful. A ring of low turbines, bicycle wheels and salvaged fan blade segments twitched in a hesitant breeze. A trough of curved tin funneled what little moisture the morning gave into a culvert. The people there were not the feral beasts I'd braced for. They were careful, gaunt, and strangely civil. There were ex-prisoners, yes, men with scars and eyes that measured threat like currency. But there were also municipal engineers, men in grease-stained jackets who still had the stubborn competence of those who once kept water moving. Mara was not the brittle whisper from the radio. She was shorter than I'd imagined, with hands that looked like they could pluck truth from wire. She had a face like an old coin, worked over and still holding value. She eyed the transmitter parts with the kind of hunger that makes mechanics into priests. "We can make a motor," she said bluntly when she saw what I had. "We can make a pump that will run on foot pedals if we have the right coils and bearings. But we'll need the alternator guts and copper. Can you splice?" I took the parts from the oilcloth and set them on a workbench they had fashioned from a door and 2 cinder blocks. To disassemble the transmitter is to strip a voice of its throat. The vacuum tubes came out like teeth. The spool yielded copper ribbons that once sang in my living room, now coiling into possibility. We worked with the speed of people who know they have one chance. Sparks crawled like fireflies across the table as we soldered, wrapped, bolted. Outside, the sky had turned an ugly, nervous green. The first drop of toxic rain tasted of pennies and old batteries when it struck the edge of the tin roof. We covered the intake and prayed to the practical gods, gaskets, bolts, friction. Blake's boys found us the next day. They didn't come all at once. They came as a shadow first, 3 riders on rusted dirt bikes circling the perimeter. Then a man in a leather jacket who called himself Blake strode into the clearing with a swagger like a ruined flag. "Warmers," he said, and everyone tight. He smelled of stolen diesel and the careless hunger that comes from holding a hot head in cold hands. Negotiations began the way raids often begin, as an offer. Water now and the hollow may keep its gears. We trade, we negotiate, we assign value. Blake wanted the pump intact and the right to guard it. Mara refused. Blake offered guns. Mara offered a history lesson about the math of extraction, that a pump in the wrong hands becomes a machine that feeds an army, not a village. Words are weapons when bullets run out or are too expensive. The child Hattie had carried coughed and sank to the ground. The cough drew a crowd of faces like constellations, each with a story in their eyes. I thought, for a second that lasted like a century, of the radio left in the post office, of the people whose names I could no longer call out, the telegrams unsent. I thought of Samira watching me with that look she had, equal parts love and indictment. I had one more decision to make. Blake's boys balked at the work we'd done. They're technicians, if you could call the men who bought the idea of engineering by intimidation technicians, sniffed and spat. They wanted something faster, louder, a running generator, a loudspeaker so they could announce ownership and draw every desperate soul. I understood what that would mean. If the hollow's pump broadcast its existence, doors would open, and the hollow would become a magnet for bullets. I walked out into the rain with a coil of copper over my shoulder and felt the world narrow to a single thought: water over voice. The transmitter in my pack was a corpse I loved. I took the final step and gave it to Mara's engineers to butcher. I didn't romanticize the act. I laid the parts down and taught them how to rewire the alternator so the motor would keep running off pedal power and a small bank of cells. I watched as the essence of my voice turned into gears that would lift water a foot at a time, greedily, relentlessly, until it fed mouths. In the compound, someone started the pedaling. At first nothing happened but the whirring of spokes and the breath of the peddler. Then, like a small animal waking, the pump took a breath and pulled. The first slick of water came up black and full of soil. We filtered it, boiled it, ran it through a charcoal bed. And then we drank, and we were not dead yet. I cried then, quietly, because the thing I'd given up was also the thing that made the world small and manageable. The radio was gone. The water flowed. Blake's boys were not placated. They wanted control, not gestures. They wanted a broadcast, acclaim, an audience. But the Hollows people, engineers and ex-prisoners stitched together by necessity, had a different plan. They agreed to watch the roads, to ration, to teach trade. They refused the easy dictatorship for the harder work of community. Blake's men left with insults and a promise that they would be back with more. On the road out, a rider fell and did not rise. We buried him with the same dull reverence we give objects that fail us. A hasty mound, a tin cup placed on top, a single cigarette stub. The rain washed the edges of the dirt and made the grave look like art. I thought of Tarek and the reasons he'd left. I thought of the faces that had been left in the road because someone else had needed a radio more than they needed a father. My hands were burned and raw from solder and effort. I had given away my voice and had no voice left to tell anyone about it. We pedaled back under a sky that threatened to show its teeth. Hattie's child's cough eased. A woman gave me a tin of preserved peaches in thanks, and I accepted it like a relic. The Hollows turbines checked under a cautious wind. The pump hummed a steady, tiny hymn. The radio was dark, and in its dark something ancient and new was singing. That night I slept in a tent on the Hollow's edge and listened to the sound of water moving where none should have been. It was not the same as hearing my own voice crackle over the band, but it was a sound that promised tomorrow. I thought of Samira and Tarek, of the ledger with its penciled entries, of the post office window where I used to watch the horizon. I'd traded my altar for a well. I did not know whether that made me a coward or a saint. I only knew it made me someone who had to live with a trade-off. In the dark, as the toxic rain hissed on the tent's canvas, I realized something. The voice I had been would not die with the hardware. It was now in the instructions we left taped to the pump, in the diagrams burned into the memory of the men who pedaled when the nights were cold, and in the way we taught a child to boil water and not to be afraid. The transmission had changed form. It had become a current of water and a set of hands that knew how to fix things. Morning came and the sky was less green, more exhausted. Blake's boys had not returned yet. We sent out a relay, a small burst of sound on a low frequency, a scrap of someone else's voice repeating coordinates learned the hard way. Hollow, water, trade parts for pedal power. The frequency was rough. Our relay was not the same as the transmitter in the post office, but it was something. It was a thread. I thought then of the ledger and the seed jars at the post office. I thought of the people who would listen and wonder why the voice had gone. I wondered whether they'd think me a fool or a traitor or a savior. None of those labels mattered much in the face of the pump's first clean sip. I cupped my hands under the stream and let the water run across my palms. It tasted like pennies and survival and the smallest sliver of grace. The climax did not feel like an ending. It felt like a hinge. We had traded one modality of resistance for another. The radio's silence made a new noise. The steady, stubborn song of water being moved where it was needed. I had disassembled my voice to build a throat for the Hollow's machine. I had chosen, in a world of terrible options, to give life rather than to speak about it. And in the bright, tired morning, as the hollow's people organized into shifts and the pump began to sing in earnest, I realized the truth that would carry me forward. Voices are important, so are hands. If one must be silenced to make the other useful, then perhaps silence is also a form of speech. The turning point was not when thunder rolled or when Blake's boys circled like vultures. It was when we decided that water mattered more than a broadcast, and we dismantled an altar to build a well. The storm that had threatened us passed on, mostly, leaving a scattered litter of wreckage and a sky that looked tired enough to be coaxed back into a softer blue. For now, there was water. For now, there was a way to survive the next week. The radio would be dead for a while. My call sign would live on in the ledger, in the lines scrawled on cardboard. K7MA gave parts hollow pedal pump September 14. Names, like seeds, were small promises you planted and hoped would sprout. I had planted one that night. I lay awake listening to the pump and to the steady pedal rhythm that meant people would sleep without thirst. I had given up my voice to make that rhythm possible. I did not know whether I had done the right thing. Later, the ledger would judge me. Right now, the water tasted clean and the child coughed less. That was enough to keep me moving. They called it the sacrifice later, as if there were neat names for the things people had to do in a time that refused neatness. I had given away my voice to make a pump. People argued about what that meant. Some said I'd traded the one thing that kept the scattered alive, the radio that stitched lonely souls into a map. Others said I'd done what had to be done. Water is louder than words when your throat is dry. After the first breath of water at the hollow, the air itself seemed to change its priorities. We celebrated not with songs, but with the slow, astonished ritual of washing hands. People cupped water into their mouths and tasted the metallic tang of survival. They made tea and protected it like a sacrament. The pump did not fix the world. It did not make the sky blue again or turn the salt back into grain, but it made a small geography where life could be negotiated rather than stolen. The immediate aftermath required labor measured in tiny increments. A pedal-powered pump is an honest thing. It gives as long as muscles give. We organized shifts. We mapped out how many liters a household could draw in an hour. We taught people to clean the charcoal filters without trashing the microflora that did the real work. I drew diagrams and taped them in the common room, heavy with grease and the smell of boiled coffee. I wrote in block letters on cardboard, check coils weekly, rewind if glazed, keep shade over storage BARRELS, rotate filter charcoal every 30 days. The handwriting is not pretty, necessity never is. We set rules because there was no other language to speak in a place where trust had been overdrafted. Mara and the engineers insisted on quotas, a ration for daily needs, a priority list for medical cases, and a small contingency for travelers in mortal condition. Ex-prisoners, municipal engineers, and a few outsiders formed a council that met under a tarp and argued. Argument meant life here. It was preferable to silent, violent decisions. Blake's boys tested those rules twice in the first month with small probes, men riding in under the sun, looking casual, asking about trade. Each time the hollow responded with a calm file of faces and a terse offer. We will feed you one meal, but to stay you trade labor or go. The second probe left with a few loose screws and a bruise. The third probe didn't come back. There were costs. The radio silence had ripple effects I could not ignore. A convoy farther south, a group who had once relied on my scheduled warnings about the pass, ran into a snarled road and was ambushed. They called me traitor in slashed ink on a scrap of wood that someone nailed to a fence. I could see their logic. I had been a node in a fragile network, and in removing myself from it, I left gaps. The guilt is a different weather than the climate. It does not pass with storms. It sits in your chest and makes the cot feel too small. I tried to make amends in ways I could. I taught. Each evening, men and women crowded in the hollow's shade and watched my hands as I rewound coils, soldered joints, and explained how to treat a lead-acid battery so it did not die the way ours had. I offered a schedule of messengers and signposts. A runner could carry a note to the nearest relay point, and the hollow would keep a small store of pre-written coordinates for trusted travelers. We invented redundancy. Bits of my former life, the ledger entries, the diagrams, the tiny soldering tips, became curricula. I could not broadcast to the world, but I could seed knowledge where a pump could keep life a little longer. If a leader dies, their tricks live on in others' hands. Nature, in the hollow's immediate shadow, remembered how to be messy and useful. The trenching that directed brackish water through the charcoal beds created damp pockets along which reeds sprouted stubbornly. The ground softened in places that had been dust for years. Dragonflies returned like small, arrogant jewels. Birds came in to drink and left with the same abrasive music they had before the collapse. You could see the difference in the green of a leaf next to the trough compared to the brittle gray of the plain beyond. It was not healing on a planetary scale, but it was a beginning. Proof that when water returns, life follows in awkward, impatient waves. Outside the hollow, the world kept its fever. Toxic rains came twice more that season, and each time we learned more about profiltering runoff and burying the contaminated topsoil. The engineers developed a rinse for the irrigation lines and a way to test, with simple indicators made from cabbage and lime. We shared those lessons at the market days and at the small camps that came through with wagons rimmed with children. Drought remained the baseline. The rains were erratic. What changed was not the weather, but our capacity to manage it where we could. Leadership in the hollow was communal and grudging. I found I was not the only person who had to become more than who they had been before. Mara turned into a coordinator, someone who could read a turbine's listen and tell when a bearing would seize up. She held people accountable with a bluntness that made efficiency feel like mercy. Hattie, once awkward with tools, learned to lash a pulley and became the boy who could set a pump faster than anyone expected. Jonas's son, steady-handed and mute with grief, became our teacher in a way that had nothing to do with words. He showed others how to balance the mass on the wheel so the pedaling would not turn into an agony. The social texture thickened. People swapped not only parts but stories. A woman named Amal, who used to teach primary school before the floods, organized a small group of children into a schedule. Morning chores, a lesson in counting grains for barter, and an afternoon where they learned to sew. It was fragile and makeshift, but it was human work. In the evenings, we sat around the pumping well and averted our faces from the sky for a while, because stars looked like a promise that might be dangerous to believe in. I still woke at odd hours and reached for a microphone that no longer pulsed with my voice. The habit of naming dates aloud persisted like a superstition. September 30, 2029, I would whisper into the dark, and habit would be its own small praise. The ledger accumulated new entries, births, deaths, repairs, and with them a sense of continuity. I kept a small, portable buzzer and a hand-cranked beacon we could fire into the sky to announce medical emergencies. It was not a voice, it was an alarm. The people who knew me used it like a thread to bring me to clinics and council meetings. I was not silent in the world. I had simply traded the wide, warm reach of radio for local stewardship. The moral arithmetic never fully balanced. For every family in the hollow that stopped needing to walk 30 miles for water, there was a person somewhere else who still listened on a silent frequency, hoping I would speak. The world would keep judging me by what it expected me to be. I kept my head down and my hands busy. I think that's the closest we come to making moral decisions that stick, not by looking for absolutes, but by choosing the work we can do and doing it well. There were moments when I missed the radio like a body misses a limb. I would lie awake and remember a voice I'd heard in the first years of collapse. A woman in a collapsed hospital who read the names of the dead out loud, so that the living might have something to tether their grief to. The radio was how we tethered ourselves then. Now the tether was the pump, the line of hands that pedaled at dawn and dusk, the list of names on the ledger that people came to add to in person. The hollow became a small magnet. It was not a city reborn. It was an experiment in scale. It taught us how to trade water without becoming hunger's landlord. It taught us how to keep knowledge from being a weapon, and how to make machines from the detritus of old lives. It also taught us how vulnerable any such place remains when oil and bullets are in play. Blake's boys returned in the winter, twice our number and slick with other people's harvests. They tried to take the pump by force. We did not win a glorious battle. We won through a stubborn combination of readiness, a hidden cache of tools that turned the bikes into traps, and the sheer refusal of a community to hand over what kept their children alive. They left with less than they had hoped, and we kept the pump. The seasons passed in increments. We expanded the pump's capacity, added another trough, and built a small nursery for seedlings that would tolerate saline air. I taught others the basics of radio theory in the evenings, not to replace the transmitter I'd sacrificed, but so people would know how to fix what remains of handheld units and short-range beacons. The hollow learned to be less lonely. Messengers carried the ledger to neighboring camps, and slowly the network that once depended on one voice began to look like a lattice, fragile, yes, but broader. Inside me something changed that was not simple to name. Where I once thought of my duty primarily as a broadcaster, a chronicler of the slow unmaking of things, I became a maker in a way that felt cleaner and more mortal. Before, I believed a voice could hold a world together. Now I saw that voice is only one part of the web. Hands, mouths, and lungs do the rest. I had to accept that silence could serve as construction. I had to accept the ledger and the pump as the new forms of transmission. Hope, after the hollow, felt less like a banner and more like a set of habits. Teaching, repairing, rationing, and telling someone how to test a well for salt before they drink. It is less romantic than I once imagined, but it is sturdier. It sleeps with me in short naps and wakes me to pedal when the batteries sag. It nags me with the knowledge that Blake's boys will come again, and that a neighbor's child might cough from the wrong kind of rain. It also glows like the small, absurd warmth of a teacup pulled from a tin and shared among strangers. The world beyond the hollow remains the same cruel, patient thing it always was. The sky is still blotched with smoke and the season still breaks rules without warning. But in the space a pump creates, we can choose who we become, petty and guarded, or generous and skilled. I gave up my voice to start that choice. In the ledger under a line that reads K7MA parts given hollow sept 14, I added a note. Teach others to speak through tools. It's a small order. It's the work ahead of me. The pump kept time like a new kind of heartbeat. It was not the tremor of a transmitter or the thin, impossible music of a human voice riding the airwaves, but it answered a simpler prayer, moving water, 1 liter at a time, into waiting hands. In the months after the hollow, the work shaped the day into something that could be lived. Dawn meant a shift at the pedals. Midday meant filter maintenance and seed counts. Dusk meant the council under the tarp, arguments that were louder than hunger but softer than gunfire. I am not the same man who used to speak into a microphone and measure the world in static. That man existed in a different economy of need, one where names and hours of broadcast stitched strangers into a fragile safety net. I miss him. Sometimes I imagine him at the post office window, listening for a reply that never comes. But missing is not action, it is a weather. You watch it move through a day, and then you do the thing that keeps you alive. For me now, that thing is tending the pump and teaching the tricks I learned the hard way. Hope is not an explosion in this place. It is a stubborn set of habits. We save seeds in labeled jars and rotate them every season. We teach children how to read water by smell and how to test pH with cabbage water. We solder and rewire, and we write diagrams in block letters and tape them where hands that are not mine will find them. We keep a small stock of antibiotics in a lockbox that the council opens only for real emergencies. We barter knowledge like currency because knowledge multiplies in ways a tin of peaches cannot. It is less glamorous than a broadcast and harder to romanticize, but it is more durable. The world outside the hollow did not suddenly stop collapsing because we taught a village to mend a coil. Toxic rains came and went. Blake's boys came twice more with new numbers and fresh swagger. Each time they left with less, and with more stories about the cost of trying to take from people who had learned to work together. The seasons keep breaking the rules. Some years are kinder. Some strike with a cruelty that feels like punishment. The map remains scribbled in pencil, not ink. Recovery, if it occurs at all, will be a geography of small successes stacked on top of ruin. Guilt is a companion that refuses to be left at the door. I think of the convoy that walked into an ambush after my broadcasts went dark. I hold the names of the lost in the ledger, a brittle book that is both confession and instruction. There are times I consider whether I should have stayed at the post office and kept the band alive. I imagine voices finding one another over the air and forging slow, stubborn networks that save travel-worn people from traps they could not see. Then I listen to a child laugh while spitting water that tastes like pennies in survival, and I realize that trade-offs are the grammar of this life. The Hollow taught us another lesson, that community is not a spontaneous god but a craft. It requires rules enforced not by violence but by ritual. Scheduled shifts, a ration card folded at dawn, a ledger entry signed in front of witnesses. It requires apprentices who learn how to wind a coil and elders who remember how to keep a diesel engine from dying uselessly. It requires people willing to say no to immediate gain for the sake of long-term survival. That is harder than it sounds because scarcity makes people short-sighted. Still, we found ways, painfully, to anchor generosity in practicality. I teach now the things I used to only whisper on the air. I show how to make a solar still from plastic sheeting and a shallow pit. I demonstrate how charcoal layered with sand and gravel can save a life if you have nothing else. I run hands through wiring and show others how to test a battery with a cheap voltmeter. I tell stories less to be heard than to be learned. When I speak, my words are instructions and names. Hattie, I say, check the coil every week. Mara, rotate the charcoal this month. The voice that taught 100 people how to tune into a frequency has become the voice that teaches a dozen how to keep a pump alive. It is smaller perhaps, and yet it reaches deeper. There are small blooms of something that could be called optimism. A strip of reed grew along the trough, and the birds began to come in the afternoons. A child who had once coughed in the dirt learned to whistle and whistled wrong and beautiful songs while he pedaled. The Hollow started receiving messengers from 2 other camps who came not to plunder, but to trade information about wells and about a pH test that could be improvised from household items. The ledger, my old habit and new tool, left the Hollow now and then, carried by runners with calluses on their palms. It was copied and recopied and taught. The idea of teaching knowledge instead of broadcasting it felt less like an exile and more like a reinvention. But hope is fragile. A single season of bad rain can wipe out a nursery. A patched bearing left unchecked will seize and the pump will cough. The Hollow is a fragile machine held together by willingness and wire. We survive by making small redundancies. 2 pedal machines instead of 1, a handful of spare diodes, a hidden barrel of fuel under a false floor. We spend afternoons inventing ways to survive without anything expensive. Ingenuity becomes the currency of the future. My final message is not a sermon. It's not a call to arms or a blueprint for utopia. It is a ledger entry and a small call to common sense wrapped in a plea. Make something useful. Teach it before you hoard it. Keep records, the names of people, the dates of repairs, the recipes that work. If you can speak, teach someone to listen in a new way. If you have a voice and you must choose between singing into the air and building a well, choose the well when people's throats are dry. If you can do both, do both. Trades are inevitable here. Trade with dignity. Remember to be human. It is the hardest and most essential instruction. In a landscape that rewards cruelty, practice small mercies. Fix a pump for someone who cannot repay you, and let the repayment be the spread of knowledge. Teach a child to test the water and accept their clumsy thanks as currency. When you make rules, make them fair. When you must defend what will keep your family alive, do it with clarity and with sorrow. Call out names. Count the dead. Tend the living. I don't know if there will be a tomorrow where we count seasons by harvest and not by catastrophe. I don't know if the hollow will become a city or a memory. I do know this. For now, people wash their hands in water that did not exist before that night we unmade my voice to make a pump. For now, children sleep with fewer coughs. For now, someone in a neighboring camp knows how to wind a coil because I taught them. For now, the ledger continues. So here is what I leave on the page and the tarp and the hearts of those who will listen. Keep making, keep teaching, keep recording. Hope is not a grand thing. It's a set of habits practiced until they become a culture. Protect the small things, seeds, diagrams, names the way you would protect a sleeping child. When you can, speak. When you must, build. When you have neither, share what you can. A tin of peaches, a match, a line of instruction written in a careful hand. If you ever hear a faint click on an old frequency and there's silence behind it, don't mistake the silence for absence. Sometimes silence is a hand at work. Sometimes it is the sound of a pump spinning at dusk, of a child learning to whistle while they pedal, of a community mending itself in increments. That is not a triumph. It is a choice. Make yours with care.